Hello and welcome to this week's edition of The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher, where we seek to find out what God is doing in Israel and the West Bank through the lives of believers who live there, Jewish believers as well as Israeli Arab and Palestinian Christians. I visit Israel often to record these programs so that you can hear the voices of these people, listen to their stories, understand their passion, and what encourages them to stay true to their faith in Jesus in a region where what you believe becomes your identity. It's still relatively uncommon for a Jewish person to believe in Jesus or Yeshua, but the numbers are growing. It is still relatively uncommon for a Muslim to change faith and become a Christian, but the numbers are increasing. For both, believing in Jesus is both culturally a taboo and can be very dangerous. Today finds us in Haifa, in northern Israel, talking to Eitan Shishkoff. He spent the first 40 years of his life living in America. In this, the first of two programs with Eitan, we hear what happened to change him from being a radical hippie to becoming a radical believer in Yeshua.
We moved to Israel at the age of 45, which was 21 years ago.
But brought up in a Jewish family?
Brought up in an assimilated family. My mother was Jewish, my father was not, and basically the family philosophy was humanism.
And you spent many years really as a bit of a rebel. You were a hippie, weren't you, for a time?
It's very true. I cycled through just about every movement and every alternative approach to life that could be found back in the 60s, beginning with the political, was part of the radical left, took part in demonstrations, spent some time in jail, and then got disillusioned with that, went on into rock music and drugs, and then finally that also I could see was not going to change me or the world, and so I adopted the commune approach. The hippie farming commune concept really captivated me, and I thought, well, let's just start everything all over again. And so as a newly married couple, we moved to the mountains of the southwestern United States in the beginning of '69.
And you lived that lifestyle for quite some years.
We did. We spent 6 years altogether without electricity.
I mean, that's quite tough going. That's hardship.
We learned a lot. Actually, while we were doing it, we didn't feel like we were suffering all that much, although there were times when sickness came and tough weather and, cars breaking down and all kinds of misadventures. One morning, my wife and I woke up to the sound of a rattlesnake in the wall right next to us, which was a pretty rude awakening. But as we were doing it, we felt that this was meaningful and special, all up until the time when a close friend was murdered, and that shook us to our foundation.
And actually was the turning point in your life?
It was. It was a profound turning point, Julie, because we realized that being out away from civilization and doing our little, farming organic thing was no guarantee that we would not be touched by the evil of the world. In a way, you could say that it was a personal 9/11 kind of awakening, because in that same sense that evil broke through into the consciousness of many people in that tragedy. Personally, the senseless murder of an innocent man whom we loved and had gone through many adventures and stages of life with absolutely destroyed what was at that time a combination of Eastern mysticism and Native American mythology mixed together with some marijuana and organic farming. It was a very eclectic soup that we had created for ourselves, but at the time it felt like it worked. We were living in nature, we were grooving on nature, as we would say, but in the face of death and having to bury this man and not knowing the destiny of his soul, I had to say, okay, I don't know anything.
And it was not knowing the destiny of his soul that was the big question for you. Who answered it for you?
Well, that was a fantastic piece of God's strategy, because he sent some young men who were from the other side of the country, who also happened to have been through the hip lifestyle. And so they didn't come across to us as straight establishment people, but they had a real experience with Jesus, and they shared that experience with us there high in the mountains. And as they were sharing that experience, God gave me a very supernatural Technicolor vision of Yeshua, Jesus, on the cross.
And that was enough to convince you?
It was so enough that I can't forget it for a moment. And I've held it. That was nearly 42 years ago. And what happened was that his eyes locked on my eyes. It wasn't that I saw him far away. I saw him up close, pretty much like I'm looking at you right now. You're holding a microphone in front of me. We're sitting not far from each other. And what I saw in his eyes was the love of God, the divine, forgiving love. And amazingly, he saw all of my junk on the inside, which we all carry in some way or another, but my junk was particular because I was proud about being humble, if you catch my meaning. I mean, there we were living on practically no money, working long hours in the fields, building our own homes, and raising our kids and growing our vegetables. And so we thought, we're pretty good. But, inside there was pride and arrogance and all kinds of judgment of other people, and yet a philosophy of love. But here was true love incarnate and hanging on the cross, bearing my guilt and everybody else's. But he communicated in such a patient, deep way that I absolutely could not deny that this was the answer to everything I'd been looking for, because I wanted to be pure. That's why I was living in the mountains without money, brown rice and vegetables, excuse me, and, trying to meditate or whatever. And he knew me inside and out and did not accuse me, but said, I'm hanging here for you. You need me to do this, and this is going to set you free in the way you've always wanted to be. And I got it. I really got it, because it was such a personal communication.
Now, Eitan, you could have stayed in the mountains. You could even have stayed living in America and had quite a comfortable lifestyle, but you came to Israel.
That's true. Well, telescoping a whole lot of changes and events, what happened was that within several years of receiving Jesus, we didn't know him as Yeshua then. My wife was also Jewish. We did not return to our Jewish heritage until several years later. We came to faith in 72. Around 75, I was reading the account of the Last Supper in the New Testament. And for some reason, it had never dawned on me. Suddenly, I realized this was the Passover meal, and that Jesus and the disciples were Jews, and they were celebrating Passover like Jewish people had done at that time for 1,400 years. Now it's 3,400 years. And it wiped me out. I just said, wait a minute. This is one book, one Bible, one account. It's all connected. And so we began to pursue our Jewish heritage as believers in Jesus. And that led ultimately to our decision to come to Israel after about an 11-year period of time in which we were in a Messianic Jewish congregation on the East Coast near Washington, D.C., and trained and learned and had entered into ministry and really fell in love with the concept, which we had kept from our hippie times, of community. And one of the greatest blessings and discoveries in the scriptures for me was that both in the book of Exodus and the book of Acts, you have the display of God's presence in the earth through community. So my little phrase is that God's address on earth is community. It's his people gathered together.
I find it very interesting that there are a number of Messianic Jewish leaders here in the land today who have a similar background to yours. They came out of the hippie movement in America.
It really is fascinating, and I think it's not by chance, because we were a searching generation. We got involved in a lot of wrong things, dark things, sinful things, immoral things, but somehow there was a timing, Julia. I think that our generation became disillusioned with technological progress, with material prosperity. It wasn't enough to satisfy the soul. And I was blessed to grow up in the 50s and 60s when, American society was prosperous. My folks came back from the war. They had both fought in the war, and life was good for many people, not everybody. And I was very fortunate, but I looked out beyond, my suburban home, and I said, well, hey, what about other people? What about the African Americans? What about the people that are dying in Vietnam because they couldn't get a student deferment, and on and on? And those questions of conscience began to lead to a spiritual quest and to dissatisfaction. So I think also the Jewish soul, if I can say it that way, senses and has been charged by God with a responsibility for world redemption. And, I wrote about this in the book that I published, because there's this responsibility to bring the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, to bring the righteous reign and the justice of God to all the nations. It's a servant role. And this is very important because it's kind of the reverse of the resentment that sometimes comes with thinking, well, what do you mean the Jews are the chosen people? Why aren't we chosen? But we've been chosen to serve everybody else. And I think actually that's a key to a proper sense of what our calling is as the people of Israel.
So when you came to Israel, did you come straight up here to the north, to Haifa?
Actually, I did. We had some very dear friends who had introduced us to Haifa. I also was aware of the fact that at that time there were not that many Messianic congregations or ministries in the greater Haifa area. And frankly, I felt that Jerusalem was a little bit intimidating. I wasn't ready for that. And I also fell in love with the fact that it's both the sea and the mountains, which were both in my background. And I like pioneering, that the thing of the whole hippie era that we were in and the living without electricity and everything. I think that we have a heritage, a legacy from the Zionist pioneers, the chalutzim, as they're called in Hebrew. And that is that even though this is a very old land, it's also a new land. That was a title of a book by Herzl, describing the whole project of coming back to Israel. So I feel like we have a calling and a responsibility to be spiritual pioneers, not just, tag on to what's already come. And so it was in that spirit that Connie, my wife, and I came 21 years ago and felt drawn to Haifa.
Eitan Shishkoff sharing his story. And we'll hear more from Eitan on next week's program. You're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher, and the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. If you would like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please either visit our website, olivetreefund.org, or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, P.O. Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA in the UK. Do join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.